Now available. Paperback and Kindle Unlimited. ISIS, the main event. It's carnage inside of a steel cage when the goddess next door steps in the squared circle with the beast from the boss in this action-packed all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, the main event, paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. Historical Men in Crisis. One of my viewers wanted me to do another installment in the Historical Men in Crisis series. And for this installment in the Historical Men in Crisis series, I'm going to be talking about comic book creator and former Marvel editor-in-chief Joe Quesada and comic book writer Tom King. Now, the first historical man in crisis I'm going to be talking about in this video is former Marvel Comics executive and comic creator Joe Quesada. Now, Joe Quesada isn't basically a man in crisis, but his lack of leadership and vision are the thing that put Marvel Comics in crisis, and put Marvel Comics in crisis where it went from being a company that was selling hundreds of thousands of comics to becoming a comic book company that barely sells 10,000 comics at this point. Now, Joe Quesada basically put the entire Marvel Comics side of the comic book industry in crisis due to his lack of experience as related to publishing and his lack of vision as a publisher and a comic creator. Now, Joe Quesada was born in Queens and grew up in Jackson Heights, and basically became a comic fan after reading The Amazing Spider-Man around the time of issue 98, where they had the drug comics that featured Harry Osborn being addicted to drugs, and this garnered his father's approval and resonated with him, and eventually he decided to aspire to have a career in comics, majoring in illustration at the School of Visual Arts, where he graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1984, and then eventually came into comics after reading the comic from Frank Miller, The Dark Knight Returns. And eventually, Joe Quesada got a job in comics when he was hired by DC based on his portfolio, which composed of 3-page sequences and a cover. And basically this led to him starting his career. And as he started his career in comics, he started off with a big bang by creating the story Batman's Sword of Azrael and co-creating the Azrael character, who became one of the big characters of the 1990s. And after creating Batman's Sword of Azrael and becoming one of the big stars of comics in the early 1990s, he also did work for the Valiant comics, such as Ninjak, Solar Man of the Atom, and other books, and basically started to become a big-time player with his inking partner Jimmy Palmiotti, and eventually they became a big part of early 90s comics. And again, as Joe Quesada started to become extremely popular for his unique art style, eventually what happened is he left Valiant and then created his own comic company, Event Comics, and created Ash, a firefighter with superpowers, who eventually became a cult character who eventually got his own action figure and other merchandise. And eventually, as he was out here, he was networking with people in comics and networking with people in comics. But sadly, what happened with Joe Quesada is what happened to many comic creators in the 90s, in that they had a very flashy style, but sadly, a lot of these individuals didn't really get the underpinnings of the craft of comics because people didn't stay long enough to learn about the business of comics. And because he didn't learn about the business of comics or learn about the craft of the business, this is where Joe Quesada was basically unfit for a role in editorial, unfit for a role of editorial. Yes, he got a lot of network connections, but he did not learn the business of the craft by working with editors like the late Mark Grunwald, or editors out here like Jim Shooter, who could teach him the underpinnings of the business as related to distribution, as related to sales, as related to the relationship with the customer. And Joe Quesada basically was one of these guys who had a lot of new jack ideas, like a lot of these creators like Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane. They had big ideas, but again, didn't understand the traditional business. And this is what really made Joe Quesada a poor fit for Marvel Comics, as he came into Marvel Comics to work for Marvel. And as he worked for Marvel, he was hired by Marvel's then editor, Bob Harris, to go out here and manage a line of Marvel books as related to a second wave of reboots known as Marvel Knights. Now, at this time, Marvel Comics had just filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy due to its disastrous distribution plan to purchase Heroes World, and that plan basically torpedoing Marvel as a corporation, because the distribution basically was leading to them taking big losses because they had to have a lot of returns. And because of those returns, they had to focus more on the direct market because they lost the retail market. And this basically led to the decline of Marvel. And this is why they decided to bring in Joe Quesada to shore up its street heroes. And as he shored up their street heroes, he had a lot of successes with books like Daredevil and The Punisher, and a cult following with an iconic run of Black Panther done by Christopher Priest. And that whole series of things led to, again, a great success as related to his division of Marvel. Unfortunately, his plans for the overall Marvel universe made real serious problems in 2000. Now, in 2000, after Bob Harris wound up leaving the company as its editor-in-chief and Bill James became the president, this is where they decided to go out here and bring Joe Quesada in as the new editor-in-chief at Marvel. But sadly, Joe Quesada did not have enough publishing experience as related to working in the publishing industry, similar to his contemporary Dan Didio, who again had no publishing experience whatsoever. And sadly, what happened over the time of Joe Quesada is that Marvel went into a major state of decline under his inexperienced leadership. Now, one of the things that Joe Quesada did that did further damage to the Marvel brand that was just coming out of a reboot situation was that he decided to go out here and reboot books that were not X-Men related or had fewer than 100 issues. And this was to try to shore up the sagging sales of these books and try to shore up these sales, because these books were basically hurting, and they were hurting mainly because Marvel had no real direction as related to its editorial, and it didn't have a direction as related to its editorial as far back as 1995, when Tom DeFalco wound up leaving. And when Tom DeFalco wound up leaving that position, he still did comics like MC2 with Spider-Girl, but the whole thing is, once he left, there was a big hole in editorial, and that hole in editorial basically did not have a vision for Marvel, and sadly, Quesada himself did not have a clear vision for Marvel. He basically himself was a guy who was used to working with basically street-level characters as related to his work on Marvel Knights, or characters like Ninjak, or characters like Ash. He was used to working with street-level characters, but he didn't understand how to work with a large universe of characters, and did not have the seasoning to work with a large universe of characters. Moreover, he was not really ready to work as related to the distribution system of comics, or to understand the overall business of comics, because after his plan to launch new #1 issues, which was something that already had been done with books like Avengers, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, and Captain America, those books basically, as they were relaunched, they had no direction after a certain point. And what Joe Quesada wanted to do was relaunch these books once again, not understanding that the damage had already been done by the last cancellation. It had already been damage had been done as related to the previous cancellation of these books, which ran back all the way back to the 1960s. And he decided to relaunch these books once again in order to get a jump start with a new #1 issue, believing that #1 meant something, when in actuality #1 really didn't mean anything if you couldn't answer the critical question with this initial run, which is, why should we care? Now, Joe Quesada's business decisions did damage to Marvel Comics all around, because it created this vicious cycle of cancellations and reboots, a vicious cycle of cancellations and reboots that basically alienated the customer base. Moreover, it led to a cancellation and reboot cycle that, well, as it alienated the customer base, made it where customers could not really come into the comic because they didn't know where to start. So Quesada basically was looking for short-term sales, but could not see where he was doing long-term damage. He couldn't see the long-term damage he was doing to all of these books, and he couldn't see the damage that he was doing to these books because people were getting confused, because he decided, after doing this policy, decided to reverse this by putting new numbers with the old numbers, further confusing people, and making it even more frustrating, because he himself, again, as a person, had no real understanding of the publishing side of the business. He had no real understanding of the publishing business and didn't understand the customer. This is something that I understand, that you just don't yank the rug out from the customers who've been buying these books for years by changing the numbers. No, you just go out here and do what previous editors do and just make it where the new creative team picks up on a certain book, like in the case of X-Men '94, where the new creative team of Len Wein and Dave Cockrum took over as related to the X-Men and continued on, or in the case of Iron Man 117, where David Michelinie and Bob Layton took over, or in the case of Captain America 305, where Mark Gruenwald took over, or in the case of Thor 337, where Walt Simonson took over. You basically create an entry point for the reader where the new creator picks up on the run. But Joe Quesada wanted to think he could put these new #1s out here, but the new #1s created a paradigm of self-destruction over at Marvel. And even worse, what happened at Marvel under Joe Quesada was we saw a lot of the books basically fall completely apart as he got the success with these series like Marvel Knights, Max, and Ultimate, which were basically run by writers like people like Jimmy Palmiotti and people like Brian Michael Bendis, and Ultimate, which was run by Bendis and Millar. And sadly, what happened under these writers is that Marvel stopped being a wide place that was just basically a universe of characters and wound up becoming a place that became more and more insular based on what Quesada knew as related to street characters. And as the Marvel Universe became more and more insular under Quesada as related to street characters, we saw books basically wind up again falling completely apart. Guys like Iron Man, who were high-tech characters who were part of a larger world, basically his book just became a complete mess under Quesada's leadership. And characters like Captain America, who were in world-span global adventures similar to Indiana Jones, his character became localized mostly to New York City. And guys like the Avengers, Earth's mightiest heroes, were no longer in world-spanning epic adventures like they were under Kurt Busiek. And the Fantastic Four stopped being fantastic. No, the Marvel Universe basically became localized to New York City, which is basically what Quesada knows, basically street characters. And as the Marvel Universe became localized to basically street characters, we got books like New Avengers, which featured characters like Spider-Man and Luke Cage, because this is what Quesada and his writers like Bendis and Mark Millar mostly knew. And since these writers really didn't understand how to make globe-spanning epic adventures, they were very limited in scope. This and the hiring of inexperienced writers like Frank Thierry and many others led to the overall decline of most of Marvel's heroes, and even worse, it led to one of the most devastating things that damaged the Spider-Man character, which was a story called One More Day. Now, Joe Quesada basically decided he didn't like Peter Parker's marriage to Mary Jane Watson, a marriage that had started in 1987 and was going on in Spider-Man comics and really didn't do much damage to the Spider-Man comics, but he didn't like this marriage, and as he decided to end this marriage by making Peter Parker make a deal with Mephisto, the devil in Marvel, in order to save the life of Aunt May, what this did was catastrophically destroyed the entire paradigm for Spider-Man comics, and catastrophically destroyed the paradigm for Spider-Man comics because the overall story model for Spider-Man was he again was a street criminal. I mean, a street hero, not a criminal, but a street hero. And as a street hero, he basically walked alone and basically was the guy who was the outsider as related to Marvel's heroes. But he had a great relationship with Mary Jane, and his stories were doing fairly well until a writer in the 90s, Howard Mackey, basically derailed the train. But guys like Ron Frenz and guys like Tom DeFalco with Spider-Girl did a great job of showing us that Spider-Man with a marriage could work very well. But sadly, what happened with Joe Quesada is he decided to end Peter Parker's marriage by having him make a deal with the devil, which was completely out of character for Peter Parker, who again, a man with great power and he has a great responsibility to others, would not make a compromise with the devil. But Joe Quesada thought this would be able to get Spider-Man back on track, but the Spider-Man character was basically derailed at this point, and the damage has never been repaired with this character due to this decision to compromise the character's integrity. This decision to compromise the character's integrity did complete damage to the Spider-Man character, and that basically did damage to Marvel's overall sales, which had been already in a bad place due to many of Quesada's bad editorial decisions to cancel and relaunch books over and over again, and his decision to go out here and focus on trade paperbacks because he wanted to go out here and get people to buy the trade paperbacks because he thought this would be a way to get people to go out here and buy books, but the whole thing is it wound up cannibalizing on comic book sales. So basically what happened with Joe Quesada is, due to his inexperience as related to the publishing business, he did a lot of damage to Marvel Comics, damage that basically was irreparable, as he created editorial mandates for stories like Civil War, which led to the darkening of Marvel's characters. Again, before Quesada, there was a hope and optimism in comics, and that was done by stories like One More Day, The Mask and the Iron Man, which created the sentient Iron Man armor, and stories like Civil War, which basically turned the characters into a gray area filled with people who had ethics issues, and the damage that was structurally done to Marvel Comics by Joe Quesada basically was irreparable. I mean, he did irreparable damage to the structure of the Marvel Universe because he didn't understand how intricate the Marvel Universe is. He didn't understand the largeness and the vastness of the Marvel Universe because he was just a writer of street heroes, and he didn't have that imagination or vision to see a larger world, a world outside the windows of people. No, after 9/11, he took us down a dark road of, again, black heroes, black and dark characters, again, because that's what he's used to doing from Marvel Knights and Max and Ultimate, and that really wasn't what Marvel was all about. Again, Marvel was supposed to be a hopeful brand, and eventually he continued to go on at Marvel, failing upwards, continuing to fail upwards at Marvel, as related to making commentary about the Red Party's Tea Party group in 2010, and then also going out here and eventually was promoted to Chief Creative Officer of Marvel Entertainment, and eventually, after he had gotten this position, it was basically they and kept him as CCO, and then it brought in Axel Alonso as editor-in-chief. And again, Quesada basically did so much damage to Marvel all around, but continued to be allowed to fail upwards. But sadly, his legacy will be known for basically putting the comic book industry in crisis. Putting the comic book industry in crisis because in 1998, when he came in, Marvel had a chance of bouncing back from the disastrous bankruptcy and the disastrous bad storylines that were put in place by that editorial. They had talent like Kurt Busiek putting in work on Iron Man and books like The Avengers, getting them back on track. They had those books going well. They had books like Spider-Man doing okay. But the whole thing is he decided to cancel a lot of these books and relaunch them. He decided to go out here and not have a plan to transition from one creator to the next, which is another thing that an editor has to do. A seasoned editor-in-chief knows that, okay, when one team is leaving, you've got to have a plan for that replacement team. And that was another problem that Joe Quesada had, is that he did not know how to transition from teams. I mean, when Kurt Busiek left Iron Man, what he did was put an inexperienced writer in Frank Thierry on the book, and he basically destroyed that book, along with the horrible artist Aletha Martinez, who could not draw. And that was further exacerbated by Karen Grant coming on and destroying that book. Same thing with Avengers. After Kurt Busiek left the book, he then didn't know what writer to put on to transition in. Same thing with Captain America after Mark Waid got the book on point with Ron Garney. He brought Jan Jurgens in, but did not have a plan to transition things. So Joe Quesada did a lot of damage to Marvel Comics because as an editor-in-chief, he did not have a vision for Marvel Comics the way Jim Shooter had a vision for Marvel Comics. And because he did not have a vision for Marvel Comics, this is one of the reasons why Marvel has been a company in crisis for over 20 years. And if it wasn't for its affiliation with corporate brands like Sony and Disney, Marvel would have been out of business many years ago, because this company was put in crisis by Joe Quesada, an editor-in-chief who didn't know anything about the publishing business. And because he didn't know much about the publishing business, and that the publishing business is sales, he basically wound up creating a mess at Marvel, that's basically impossible to fix at this point, because right now Marvel is in crisis due to Joe Quesada and his lack of ability to be able to effectively run a comic company that he wound up putting in crisis. Now, the second historical man in crisis I'm going to be talking about is comic book writer Tom King. Now, Tom King was known for a run in Marvel Comics on the Vision, which led to propelling him to fame. However, he soon became known for an infamous series of runs of comics that wound up alienating comic book readers due to his whole approach to storytelling. And that whole approach to storytelling basically is rooted in the dysfunctional home that he was raised in by his single mother, and in that home is where he learned how to become a beta male who eventually became a man in crisis, who created a crisis among comic fans due to his really inept form of storytelling. Now, Tom King basically grew up in Southern California, and he was raised by a single mother and was also raised by a grandmother. And inside of that gynocentric home environment, he basically developed a love for storytelling that he learned from seeing his mother work in the film industry. Now, Tom King went out here and interned at both DC and Marvel Comics in the late 1990s and studied both philosophy and history at Columbia University. And with his Ivy League background, many people thought that he would be a very gifted and talented writer after interning and working with writers like Chris Claremont before joining the CIA to work in a counterterrorism unit. But eventually, after working at the CIA, he quit the CIA to write his debut novel. And then after writing that debut novel, eventually he went on to start working in comics. And as he worked in comics, sadly, he did not improve the craft of comics, that people would expect him to do based on his Ivy League background and his internship with legendary comic book writer Chris Claremont. Sadly, what happened with Tom King is that he really showed that he did not have a good grasp as related to the craft of comic storytelling, and did not have a craft for storytelling, because he basically looked to go out here and approach stories from his own perspective, and like other contemporaries like Brian Michael Bendis, basically thought he knew better than the previous creators and looked to take characters in his own direction. And this is what he looked to do as related to comics. This is what he looked to do with comics overall. And basically he got a lot of acclaim with the comic book The Vision as related to his take on the Vision, where he was looking to create a family, but that really didn't fit within the character of the Vision, who had already been through this type of storyline in the legendary miniseries Vision and the Scarlet Witch, where he already had a human family, but this time he wanted to create a robot family. And yes, it got a lot of critical acclaim among people because of Tom King's pedigree, but it really didn't show how he was going to add any sort of contribution to the character overall. No, as he went out here, Tom King was again allowed to go out here and create new versions of characters, like he did with the Omega Man book and with a couple of Vertigo books. And as he went on, he again continued to get that support as related to those books. But when he came into mainstream comics, this is where he started to have problems, because people expected him to be able to write a cohesive book that would fit within the DC universe. And this is where people started having problems with Tom King, because yes, he could work with concepts like Omega Men or a Vertigo story or even a Vision story, but when it came time for him to write the Batman character, which people thought he could be able to write because of his mentoring by Chris Claremont and his Ivy League degree, he showed how very limited he was as related to his skill set, as related to his craft, as related to being a writer, because he was looking to, again, approach the character from his own perspective, but his perspective really didn't fit what comic fans wanted to see in a Batman book. And as he started his new run of Batman, which he planned to do 100 issues, he was having problems because he showed he had no real understanding of the character. Moreover, his whole story model and approach to story basically was extremely slow, and his pacing basically graded people as related to things. And what further exacerbated the situation in relation to his really slow pacing, his weak dialogue, was the fact that there was very little action in these Batman comics. Moreover, there was not much action or much mystery as related to Batman, because Batman is a detective, and Tom King couldn't do a good job of writing the Batman character because, one, he really never had much experience with socializing and interacting with men due to the gynocentric home he came from, where he was raised by a mother and a grandmother, and two, he was basically not understanding how men operated because he didn't have much good social interactions with men. And three, he didn't go out here and look to do research on the works of previous writers like the late Alan Grant or many of the other writers to make sure his Batman stories fit within the Batman lore. No, he wanted to go out here and write his own Batman and in his own way. And sadly, his run on Batman, while it built up, basically felt more like a soap opera than a superhero story, and it basically alienated a lot of readers when he built up everything for this wedding between Bruce Wayne and Selina Kyle, or Batman and Catwoman, and eventually he didn't pay off in the 50th issue. And as he didn't pay off in the 50th issue, people got upset with Tom King. They got upset with Tom King because his stories basically had you buying comics that went nowhere, set up a lot of stuff, but didn't pay off, and even worse, didn't even really develop these characters and show them being consistent with the actions of previous runs. So a lot of people had issues with Tom King as a writer because he didn't know how to function as a man, and basically had Bruce Wayne acting like a beta male. A beta male because this was the life experience he had as a man, and he further exacerbated this by continuing on with other storylines like City of Bane, where he basically killed Batman's male figure, Alfred, because he had an issue with male figures and male authority, and had an issue with male figures and male authority. I believe this is one of the reasons why he possibly wound up quitting the Central Intelligence Agency, because he had to deal with male authority figures and deal with men. And the whole thing is that in the comics book industry, they basically were so enamored by his pedigree, he thought he could get away with stuff. But eventually, during his Batman run, he had alienated so many comic fans that Batman, which was at the time of about 2016 or so, or 2015, was selling anywhere from about 75 to 100,000 copies a month, dropped all the way down to 50,000 copies, and has been dropping ever since. Tom King left the book with the 85th issue, and after another writer, James Tynion IV, was put on the book, it continued to slide, and it was Tom King's whole approach to Batman that wound up alienating so many people. And even though he was, again, given an Eisner Award for his work on Batman, his work on Batman really didn't sell to comic fans, and basically led to the complete decline of Batman as a character at DC Comics, because Tom King was one of these beta males who, again, has no understanding of manhood, because he never learned from a father about male life skills or male survival skills or how to navigate life as a man. And this is something that a writer has to understand if they're writing a character like Batman, is understand how life works for a man. And that was shown in the pages of his Batman, that he didn't really understand how life for men worked. He didn't understand how men operated, and basically did a mess with, not with Batman, but further exacerbated that mess with the series Heroes in Crisis, where he did damage to the character of Wally West. Again, another man who was raised by other men, like his uncle Barry and his father. He didn't understand Wally West and made a mess of that character with the book Heroes in Crisis, which basically had people seeing Tom King as a man in crisis who didn't understand how the world of superheroes worked. And since he didn't understand how the world of superheroes worked, he basically did damage to the DC, to two of DC's flagship characters in Wally West and Batman, and then further did more damage to other characters like Supergirl and Woman of Tomorrow, and then is currently doing damage right now to the Wonder Woman character, who was a part of Dawn of DC. And his Wonder Woman is considered to be one of the worst comic book runs in history, considered to be one of the worst runs in comics, because sadly Tom King doesn't have a balanced perspective as related to storytelling, and he doesn't have a balanced perspective as related to storytelling because he never had a father in his life, and because he never had a father in his life to show him how the world works for men, he makes dysfunctional comics that show you a dysfunctional perspective of superheroes, and his dysfunctional perspective of superheroes basically doesn't show you a balanced picture of what being a hero is. No, many of his books basically are very slow. They're filled with lots of exposition, filled with lots of talking scenes, and very little action, because he comes from a gynocentric perspective. And because he comes from a gynocentric perspective of women who basically are more social, he doesn't understand how things work for men. No, he doesn't understand that men are active. Men work every day. Men go out here and build. Men use their minds, again, to think critically and analytically. These are things that Tom King does not really understand as a man. No, he's a male who, again, got a lot of academic accolades, has gotten a lot of critical praise, but sadly doesn't have any sort of craft. And since he doesn't have any sort of craft, he basically put the brand of DC's flagship character in a crisis. Three of them, he's already done damage to Batman. He's done damage to Wally West Flash. He's done damage to Wonder Woman. And again, all because He's got a pedigree on his name as related to being mentored by Chris Claremont, but sadly, he has no understanding of craft because, again, when he worked with Chris Claremont, he was not working with the Chris Claremont in his prime. He was working with Chris Claremont, who had basically been struggling as a writer ever since the late 80s, because Chris Claremont in and of himself is not the writer he used to be. No, Chris Claremont, basically, he wound up losing his craft a long time ago, and if it wasn't for his reputation for the Phoenix Saga, people would see him as basically a writer who lost a step a long time ago because he's basically out here, he was writing these mismatched stories with really these threads that went all over the place but never came to a solid resolution. And again, Tom King really is not a good writer all around. He's not a good writer because he doesn't know anything and he only writes what he knows. And again, he fails upwards in the comic book industry, similar to Joe Quesada. And like Joe Quesada, he basically puts the comic book industry in crisis due to his incompetent writing, because most people know that when Tom King is writing a comic, it's just going to be a disaster, and it's a disaster because, sadly, while he's got an Ivy League pedigree, he doesn't have any sort of skills. And this is what happens with beta males. They'll get, again, lots of pedigrees as related to degrees, but their skills will be lacking. And again, their skills will be lacking because these men don't have that foundation of manhood as related to male life skills or male survival skills to know what life is like for a man. And that's what leads to Tom King's doing damage in the comic book industry, continuing to get jobs and fail upwards, creating a crisis in the comic book industry, which has led to the industry going into a state of decline, with the big two comic, Batman, under his leadership and the Wonder Woman comic under his leadership, struggling to get sales because people look at his resume and see his pedigree but don't see any passion. That's another problem with Tom King as a writer. He doesn't have much passion for anything that he does, and because he doesn't have much passion for what he does, he puts comics in crisis, and puts comics in crisis because he basically doesn't know what it means to be a man, and this man in crisis puts comics in crisis because he doesn't know how to tell a story in the medium. Now, if you want to learn how to identify the behavior of a beta male and how to help a person break out of the paradigm of the beta male that leads to them having a really poor life and just making a mess out of their own life and the lives of others, you can pick up my book, The Man Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Man Crisis at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. And if you'd like to see me make more videos about historical men in crisis, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App for a minimum of $15. And if I know something about that person or that time or a couple or person in history, I will make that video for you. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available on Lulu. John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at lulu.com today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Illuminati. The man who rules the world takes on the head of the global elite in this all-new action-packed John Haynes series adventure. Get your copy of John Haynes, Illuminati in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, The Man Crisis. Learn why so many men are struggling to find their way in an increasingly gynocentric world in The Man Crisis. Get your copy of The Man Crisis in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.